Hey there! Tonight I'm inviting you on a journey into the raucous, ragged, and remarkably creative world of medieval drinking, where getting tipsy wasn't just a Friday night activity, but sometimes an actual survival strategy. Imagine a time when your local water supply was more likely to kill you than refresh you, and the only thing standing between you and a swift trip to the grave was a mug of something foamy, mysterious, and slightly sour. By the end of tonight's ride, you'll discover the shocking truth about who really ran the best breweries in Europe. And, trust me, it is not who you think. If you're into these kinds of offbeat, shadowy corners of history, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. But only if you're actually enjoying yourself. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing this weird little global tavern come alive after dark. So, dim those lights, get yourself comfortable, maybe grab a drink of your own, though I'd recommend choosing something a little safer than water straight from the local stream, and get ready for a trip back in time. Picture it. You're a peasant somewhere in 13th century Europe. The rooster's been crowing since before dawn, and you've been working the fields, mud up to your knees, the sun baking your back, and blisters blooming on your hands. You're thirsty, desperately so, but reaching for a glass of water would be a rookie mistake. The kind that separates the seasoned survivors from the freshly buried. Instead, you grab a battered wooden tankard and gulp down a lukewarm ale. Not because you're angling for a buzz, not because you're about to launch into a spontaneous jig with your fellow villagers. No, you're drinking ale because in this era, water is basically medieval Russian roulette. See, the rivers and wells that snake through your village aren't just sources of refreshment. They're the medieval equivalent of a hazardous waste dump. Everything winds up in them: sewage, dead livestock, the odd unlucky traveler who took a wrong turn at the crossroads, and all the unspeakable runoff from the market square. Nobody in your village has heard of bacteria or germ theory, but through centuries of trial and some extremely unpleasant error, it's well known that drinking straight from the stream is a pretty effective shortcut to spending your final hours groaning in a ditch, or worse, being the next thing that ends up in the water. But humans are nothing if not inventive, especially when their lives depend on it. Enter small beer. This low-alcohol, gently fermented concoction made from grains, barley, and whatever wild yeast happened to be floating around the barn was the beverage of choice for everyone from grumpy elders to sticky-fingered kids. It wasn't fancy. It didn't knock you flat, but it was safer than the plague-ridden puddle out back, and that counted for a lot. Children drank it. Nuns drank it. Monks, especially monks, drank it, though their version was a little more, shall we say, refined. Now, brace yourself for this next bit. The average medieval European was guzzling about a gallon of ale every day. Yes, you heard that right. A full, frothy gallon. That's not because everyone was staggering around in a perpetual state of inebriation. Sure, there were a few regulars who could put your wildest college house party to shame, but for most folks it was simple. They didn't trust the water, and ale was the next best thing. Plus, it was cheaper and easier to whip up than wine, especially if you lived north of the Alps, where grapes had about as much chance of survival as a snowball in July. Ale wasn't just a drink. It was a food group, a lifeline, and, let's be honest, A calorie bomb in a mug. Think of it as liquid bread, but with fewer chewable bits than whatever the local miller tried to pass off as a loaf. And don't get the wrong idea. People weren't tumbling into haystacks at noon, seeing double. The alcohol content in small beer hovered around 1 to 2%, just enough to kill off the nastier bugs in the water, not enough to start a tavern brawl before sunrise. That said, if you skipped breakfast and went hard on the ale, things could get a little wobbly, and you might find yourself arguing with a chicken by mid-afternoon. While peasants were chugging their way through the day just to stay alive, monks were up to something a little more sophisticated. Imagine a cloistered world filled with the scent of yeast and the low hum of Gregorian chants. Between copying manuscripts and regretting their vows of celibacy, monks were quietly becoming the original craft beer gurus of Europe. These men of the cloth were not just casual sippers. Their monasteries doubled as full-blown brewing operations, with production lines that would put some modern microbreweries to shame. And why the monks? Well, for starters, monasteries were among the cleanest, most orderly places around, at least by medieval standards. They were full of men with spare time, decent literacy, and access to the kind of big pots and tools that made brewing in bulk possible. Brewing wasn't just a hobby. It was woven into the monastic routine, right alongside praying, fasting, and passive, aggressively critiquing each other's illuminated letters. They brewed to serve guests, pilgrims, the poor, and, of course, themselves. And, let's not kid ourselves, Brother Pius was absolutely sneaking a pint between vespers and matins, probably while shooting a dirty look at the abbot. Monks didn't just brew, they innovated. Unlike the average peasant who tossed whatever grains were handy into a pot and hoped for the best, monks meticulously recorded their recipes. They measured ingredients, monitored fermentation times with the precision of a Swiss watch, and, most crucially, introduced hops to the process. Yes, hops. The magical plant that gives beer that distinctive bitter kick and lets modern hipsters insist that their IPA obsession is a sign of sophistication, not a cry for help. The monks took small beer to the next level, brewing stronger, richer concoctions. Why? 2 reasons. First, because they could. When your only competition is a muddy bucket of peasant swill, the bar isn't exactly set high. Second, and perhaps most brilliantly, because medieval fasting rules banned solid food, but not beer. This theological loophole gave rise to what the monks affectionately called liquid bread. It had calories, flavor, and enough alcohol to make chanting at sunrise a little more bearable. Some monasteries got so good at this that their beer became legendary. People traveled for miles, not to pray, but to sample the abbey's finest brews. By the 14th century, some monasteries were running what could only be described as medieval microbreweries, complete with branding and regional fame. Forget Chad in flannel. Think, Brother Gregory, with a tonsure and a secret East culture that's been passed down since Charlemagne. Even today, some beers still carry names that harken back to those holy origins, proof that medieval monks understood the sacred bond between a man and his mug, maybe even better than they understood Latin. And if you're imagining monks as sober, pious types, think again. Monastic beer was not just a sideline. It was a way of life, and sometimes a way to sneak a little joy into those long, chilly nights in the cloister. Now, let's step outside the monastery walls and into the heart of medieval social life, the tavern. Before Instagram, before Facebook, before anyone could ruin their reputation with a poorly worded tweet, there were taverns. These were the beating hearts of every town and village, the place where news got passed, fights broke out, marriages were arranged, and occasionally, someone got so drunk they accidentally confessed to a minor heresy. Taverns were more than watering holes. They were the medieval answer to the town hall, the office party, and the neighborhood Reddit thread all rolled into one. You went to hear gossip, argue about taxes, complain about the weather, or find out which neighbor had mysteriously vanished. The decor left a lot to be desired. Dirt floors layered with straw, benches that threatened to collapse if you so much as sneezed, an open hearth belching smoke into the rafters, and a tavern keeper who may or may not have washed the mugs since the last lunar eclipse. The air was thick with the aroma of garlic, sweat, wood smoke, and the lingering regret of last night's round. On any given evening, you might find the place packed with a motley crew of farmers, traders, travelling minstrels, and the occasional monk looking for pastoral outreach. There'd be dice games in one corner, a rickety table of musicians tuning up in another, and perhaps an impromptu pig auction squeezed in between. As for the drink selection, let's just say variety wasn't the selling point. Ale was king, with cider making an occasional cameo, and if you were flush with coin, you might score a cup of wine, usually sweetened, spiced, or perfumed, to mask the fact that it had travelled farther than most of the patrons ever would. But no one was there for the menu. They came for the chaos, the camaraderie, and the chance to forget, if only for an evening, the back-breaking grind of medieval life. Taverns were social pressure valves, letting off steam in a world where most people worked from dawn to dusk for little more than blisters and a handful of coppers. Inside, social boundaries blurred. Peasants might rub shoulders with merchants. Clergy might share a bench with the town blacksmith, and every once in a while someone would attempt to deliver a speech in Latin after 2 mugs of ale, with predictably disastrous results. In the glow of the hearth, everyone was equal, until someone knocked over a jug, and then all bets were off. Naturally, not everyone was a fan of this liquid democracy. Church leaders railed against taverns as dens of sin, and city councils tried to regulate them with about as much success as herding geese. But the reality was simple. Taverns were essential. They held communities together, gave people a place to vent, and offered a stage for losing arguments, money, and, on the worst nights, your memory. Now, let's talk about how your social standing determined not just what you drank, but how spectacularly you could embarrass yourself while doing so. Getting drunk in medieval Europe was not a one-size-fits-all affair. Think of it as a towering, unstable wedding cake of inebriation, with different layers for peasants, nobles, and the ever-thirsty clergy, plus a goat sleeping under the bottom tier, just for good measure. Start at the bottom, the peasants. If you were a village labourer, your drink of choice was small beer or weak cider, not because you were looking for a good time, but because it was one of the few reliable pleasures in a life filled with taxes, frostbite, and the occasional angry goose. Peasants drank from wooden cups, clay jugs, or even their bare hands if things got desperate. Getting properly drunk wasn't the everyday goal. But on feast days, you could bet your last turnip that someone would wake up in a haystack, missing half their dignity and wearing someone else's shoes. Climb a few rungs up the social ladder, and you hit the nobility. Here, alcohol was all about status. Nobles drank wine, ideally imported, extravagantly expensive, and served in goblets that looked better suited to jousting than sipping. Their wine was often sweetened, spiced, or perfumed, because nothing says, "I'm important," like a drink that smells like a bouquet and costs more than a peasant's yearly wages. Feasts in noble courts were legendary for their sheer excess. Course after course, endless refills, and toasts so long you could grow a beard mid-sentence. Getting drunk was not just tolerated, it was expected, as long as you did it gracefully. Slurred Latin and wine-stained robes were par for the course, but vomiting on the bishop's lap was still considered a social faux pas. And then you have the monks and clergy, floating somewhere between the peasants and the princes. Monasteries brewed beer by the barrel, and priests sipped wine, officially for sacramental purposes, which is medieval code for tipsy by vespers. Let's be honest, some of those sermons got a lot more interesting after 2 cups of the abbot's private reserve. But no matter who you were, peasant, noble, or cloistered monk, the one universal rule was simple: don't waste the booze. Every drop was precious, the product of back-breaking labor, patient fermentation, and more than a little luck. If you wasted it, you risked a fight with the baker, a night in the stocks, or worse, being mocked for weeks. Alcohol was the great medieval equalizer. It dulled the misery for the poor, inflated the egos of the rich, and gave everyone, from the humblest field hand to the most pompous baron, a reason to raise a glass, make a toast, and, just maybe, create a legend that would be retold in taverns for years to come. All right, now that you've gotten a taste of just how intertwined drinking was with daily medieval life, you're probably itching to know what exactly was sloshing around in those mugs, goblets, and clay jugs. Was it all watery ale and questionable cider? Or did the medieval world offer a few surprises on the drink menu? So you might be wondering, what exactly did medieval people drink when they wanted to unwind or just survive another day of ploughing, plague, or papal taxes? Let's pull up a bench and find out. Let's step right into the smoky, raucous heart of medieval daily life, where survival often depended on your ability to outdrink a plague, outlast a tax collector, or simply forget that you had to share your bed with both your siblings and a family of mice. Picture yourself trudging home after a day spent breaking your back in the fields, dodging outbreaks and holy decrees, only to find salvation not in prayer, but in a battered wooden mug filled to the brim with whatever passed for refreshment that season. Let's start with ale, the absolute lifeblood of the medieval beverage menu, and the unofficial sponsor of every peasant's bad decision. Imagine this. It's unfiltered, uncarbonated, and so hearty you might need to chew before you swallow. Ale was crafted from barley, oats, or whichever grain managed to survive the rat onslaught that week. And it came in a spectrum of strengths. There was small beer, barely alcoholic and safe enough for toddlers and nuns, regular ale for the working masses, and, when the day demanded it, the sort of brew that could make you see saints or recite the Canterbury Tales in your undergarments, sometimes both simultaneously. But if you fancied yourself a bit of an epic hero, or just had a sweet tooth, you'd reach for mead. Mead was the medieval answer to anyone who thought their drink should come with a side of legend. It's honey and water, fermented into something golden, strong, and just the right amount of dangerous. If ale was the village plumber, dependable and always a little muddy, mead was the wandering bard, clutching a lyre and making intense eye contact from across the smoky hall. Mead was the go-to for feasts, or for people who wanted to feel mythological without the hassle of actually slaying a dragon. Now, if you were lucky enough to have coin, or perhaps a family crest, you'd find yourself sipping wine. Wine was reserved for the rich, the monks with a loophole in every rule, and any southern European who thought water was just wine that hadn't reached its potential. But let's be clear, medieval wine was not the stuff of candlelit romance. Often sour, occasionally weak, and frequently improved with herbs, spices, or, for the truly bold, a splash of seawater. Yes, seawater. Because nothing quite says elegance like a goblet of red with the aftertaste of regret and low tide. Not to be outdone, the orchard regions brought us cider and perry, fermented apple and pear drinks that were fizzy-ish, sweet, and so dangerously drinkable you could polish off a flagon before realizing your legs had stopped listening to your brain. These were the drinks of choice for anyone whose idea of a good time involved trees, a lack of supervision, and the phrase, "It's just fruit juice, how strong can it be?" Of course, medieval creativity didn't stop at the normal. Enter bracket, the unholy offspring of beer and mead, potent enough to remove barnacles from a ship's hull, and guaranteed to fuel at least one questionable tattoo decision per village. Or maybe you'd try posset, the drink for anyone who looked at their curd of milk and thought, why not add ale and see what happens? The result was a hot, foamy concoction best described as a soup brewed by someone with a grudge against cows. Then there were the so-called medicinal drinks, herb-infused wines, that, according to what would have been the label if they'd actually existed, claimed to cure everything from headaches to even demonic possession. Did they work? Who knows? But after 3 cups, it really didn't matter. And for the fearless, or perhaps just the foolish, there was ale mixed with raw egg. Was it for strength? Maybe. Did it smell like something you'd regret for the rest of the week? Absolutely. Now, you might think this was just the Tuesday night routine. But if you really wanted to witness medieval drinking culture in full, you had to attend a feast. Imagine the scene. Not a polite dinner party, but an all-night, no-holds, barred celebration of meat, music, and monumental quantities of booze. Feasts erupted for any reason, weddings, holy days, the birth of a new heir, or simply because the local lord wanted to show off his latest goblet shaped like a falcon mid-scream. Drinking began before the first course hit the table. Gallons of wine and strong ale flowed, and participation wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory. Turn down a toast, and you'd be labelled a killjoy, a heretic, or worse, a Norman sympathizer. Toasts themselves were grand affairs, speeches, blessings, and the occasional thinly veiled insult wrapped in a poem. After every toast came another round of food, another round of drink, and, inevitably, another round of consequences. Nobles made a spectacle of drinking from gold, silver, or horn-shaped cups, because even their hangovers had to be ostentatious. Meanwhile, servants darted between tables, refilling mugs, clearing away trencher plates, those edible slabs of stale bread that doubled as both dish and midnight snack, and quietly judging the debauchery unfolding around them. As the night wore on, the feast spiraled into chaos. Inhibitions evaporated, and what began as dignified conversation devolved into slurred singing, impromptu wrestling matches, and storytelling that seemed to get longer and more incoherent with every refill. Imagine two knights dueling, not with swords, but to see whose beard had most retained its dignity after the third course. Just when you thought things couldn't get stranger, the entertainers arrived, minstrels, dancers, jugglers, and that one guy who always managed to turn shadow puppets into a scandal after too much mead. All of it fueled by the endless river of booze that kept the party roaring. If you were lucky, you'd stagger home in the early hours, full of roast goose and questionable joy. If fortune turned against you, you'd wake up beneath the table, entangled with a jester and a broken lute, swearing off drink forever, at least until next week's feast. In the end, medieval feasts were structured chaos, an unpredictable blend of ritual and riot. Alcohol wasn't just a beverage, it was the glue that held the party together and the accelerant that set it on fire. And if you thought that was wild, just wait. Because if you think beer pong is the pinnacle of human achievement, let me introduce you to the uproarious, sometimes perilous world of medieval drinking games, where the rules were flexible, the stakes were high, and the only thing lower than your odds of winning was the likelihood you'd remember any of it the next morning. Step right up, time travelers, and brace yourself for the main event of the medieval social calendar. Drinking games so rowdy, even your wildest frat party would look like a knitting circle in comparison. The medieval version didn't involve ping-pong balls, but the stakes were higher. The rules were a moving target, and the chance of injury hovered somewhere between almost guaranteed and who needs teeth anyway. In the Middle Ages, getting absolutely hammered wasn't some accidental outcome of socializing. It was the main objective, and the games were just there to make sure the ale kept flowing and the chaos never stopped. Now, picture yourself squeezed onto a wooden bench in a smoky, torch-lit hall. The air is thick with the smell of roast meat and spilled mead. A bard is mangling a tune in the corner. Goats are wandering underfoot. Because, of course, it's not a proper party without livestock, and the local lord has just challenged everyone to an epic round of toasting wars. Forget clever wordplay or heartfelt tributes. This is a contest of sheer volume, each participant raising their tankard with such gusto that you're half convinced the roof beams will come down. It's not about crafting the most poetic toast. It's about managing to stay upright and pronounce to the king's goat without accidentally proposing marriage to the fireplace. If shouting yourself hoarse isn't your style, don't worry. There's always casting the dice, the medieval answer to every modern game of chance, except with bone-carved cubes, shifting rules, and prizes that range from a few grubby coins to the right to make someone else chug a mysterious brown liquid. The only guarantee is that, at some point, someone will accuse someone else of cheating. Congratulations, you just unlocked the bonus round, the medieval bar fight. But don't worry, we'll get to that spectacle soon enough. And then, of course, there's the classic. Who can drink the most, the fastest? Subtlety was not a medieval virtue. This game was less about winning and more about earning bragging rights and, possibly, an express ticket to liver failure. Men boasted about the number of tankards they could down before slipping into a blissful stupor, while everyone else took bets on who would be the first to face plant into the nearest turnip bin. In noble circles, things got a little more refined, at least on the surface. Picture a lady in elaborate headgear, raising an eyebrow and challenging a knight to polish off a goblet in her honor. Naturally, he'd accept with dramatic flair, maybe dash off a rhyming couplet on the spot, and try desperately not to belch halfway through the second stanza. Of course, it wasn't all about who could outdrink or outtoast. There were games with real, physical consequences, balancing contests, spinning challenges, and the ever-popular Wrestle the Minstrel round, which usually ended with someone pinned under a pile of laughter, spilled ale, and questionable dignity. The furniture rarely survived the night, and neither did anyone's sense of moderation. The point was never really to declare a winner. The point was to drink more, laugh harder, and test the structural integrity of both your friendships and the tavern stools. But here's the twist. In medieval Europe, drinking wasn't just a social activity. It had divine endorsement. The church, that ever-watchful eye on the morality of the masses, loved to wag a finger at tavern brawls and drunken revelry. But when it came to wine, well, that was a different story. Wine was holy, sacred, and, let's be honest, delicious. Every mass required the priest to lift the chalice, speak a few sacred words, and, presto, the wine was now the literal blood of Christ. And guess who drank it? The priest, of course. Not just once, but several times a week, sometimes daily. It wasn't exactly a cathedral keg stand, but it did mean the clergy enjoyed a steady intake of quality vintage, all under the watchful eye of the Almighty. And wine wasn't just for communion. Oh no. Monasteries across Europe became hotbeds of fermentation, churning out barrels of wine and ale, supposedly for religious ceremonies, but always with a little extra for the road. Monks kept meticulous records of their favorite vintages, praised the mysteries of fermentation as a gift from above, and occasionally delivered sermons with a slightly more generous slur than usual. The church may have preached moderation, but behind closed monastery doors, the line between piety and party was, shall we say, flexible. Let's not leave out the saints either. Some of them practically moonlighted as the patron protectors of party culture. Saint Bridget of Ireland once prayed for a lake of beer to quench the thirst of the heavenly host. Yes, you heard that right. A literal lake of beer, straight from the prayer book. Saint Arnold of Soissons, meanwhile, built his reputation on saving thousands during the plague, not by miracles or medicine, but by urging people to drink beer instead of water. Science? Absolutely not. Accidentally correct? You bet. Since medieval water supplies were basically roulette wheels for dysentery. So, in a roundabout way, the saints were out here advocating for the original hair of the dog. And let's talk about religious festivals. Christmas, Easter, saints' days. These were less about quiet contemplation and more about raucous feasting, endless singing, and enough ale or mead to make you forget the cold and the existential dread. pilgrims stopping at monasteries were often greeted with a loaf of bread, a patch of straw, and just enough wine to make the next leg of the journey feel a little less penitential and a lot more questionable. If you woke up, passed out under the altar table, you weren't condemned. You were resting in the presence of the Lord. Try explaining that to your priest today. Of course, the church did occasionally crack down on excess. Drinking too much was frowned upon, at least in public. A noble who got a little too rowdy might get a stern talking to and an extra prayer. A peasant, meanwhile, could expect a less forgiving response, a one-way trip to the stocks. And if you were a monk who got caught reflecting a little too deeply in the wine cellar, you might just find yourself reassigned to the most remote, least boozy outpost in the diocese. Still, no one could deny that, in a world where beer was often safer than the local well, overindulgence was an occupational hazard. And let's not pretend that medieval society didn't draw the line somewhere. Once you stumbled past, merrily tipsy, into shouting at livestock territory, that's when the consequences kicked in. Enter the stocks, the Middle Ages answer to community service, public shaming, and social media cancellation, all rolled into one creaky wooden contraption. Picture yourself waking up to find your ankles, wrists, or neck locked in place in the town square, exposed to the elements and the judgment of every passing neighbor, chicken, and goat. The local kids might lob a few rotten vegetables your way, monks would mutter, scripture with an air of disappointment, and the town gossip would make sure your tale lived on for weeks to come. Getting sentenced to the stocks for public drunkenness was hardly unusual. All it took was a little too much noise, a poorly timed insult, or a public performance of what you claimed was interpretive dance. But everyone else agreed was just falling over repeatedly. If you vomited somewhere sacred, or somewhere strategically inconvenient for the mayor, well, you could expect a front row seat to your own humiliation. The punishment was as much social as it was physical. Friends, family, and that one neighbor who never liked you anyway could all enjoy a front row seat to your suffering. Children would pelt you with yesterday's turnips. The blacksmith's wife would shake her head and whisper, "Again?" And your only real comfort was that, by evening, someone else would probably take your place. But, and here's the kicker, the real crime wasn't drinking. It was being bad at drinking. Nobles could drink themselves into oblivion at banquets with no consequences. But if a cobbler toppled into a pig trough after his third ale, suddenly it was a moral failing, a crisis for the whole village. Authorities weren't worried that you'd had too much to drink. They were worried about what unpredictable drunken people might do. Slurred speeches and wobbly dancing were fine behind closed doors, but out in the streets? That's where revolts, riots, and, worst of all, folk songs got started. Some towns even tried to keep things under control, with official ale tasters, whose job was to make sure the tavern beer wasn't too strong, or at least not stronger than the mayor's own drink. But really, being drunk in public was rarely seen as a crime. It was more like a mark of mild disgrace, a social slap on the wrist. You weren't a criminal, just someone who got a little too medieval on a Wednesday night. A few hours in the stocks, a bruised ego, and you'd be back at the tavern by the weekend. Only quieter this time. Maybe. And what about the aftermath? Hangovers in the Middle Ages were just as brutal as you'd expect, only without the luxury of painkillers or sympathetic roommates. Imagine waking up on a pile of scratchy straw, the church bells ringing loud enough to split your skull, and a goat giving you the side eye because you apparently mistook its stall for your bed. There was no calling in sick. You had chores, obligations, and a community ready to remind you of your antics. Most people just muttered about sin, staggered back into the daylight, and hoped nobody had sketched their latest disaster for posterity. For those determined to find a cure, the options were creative. The most popular remedy, a mix of raw eggs and ale, because nothing says fresh start, like combining last night's poison with this morning's salmonella risk. Others swore by vinegar, fennel tea, or herbs steeped in boiling water, a recipe guaranteed to taste like regret and old socks. If you were lucky enough to know a doctor, and I use that term in the loosest sense, he'd probably talk about imbalanced humors and suggest a good bleeding. Nothing says cure, like losing a pint of blood when you already feel like death. And for some, the only solution was to keep drinking. Yes, the hair of the dog is older than you think, and medieval folks figured, well, if I already feel like death, why not double down? The church, predictably, had its own take. Hangovers weren't just your body's revenge, they were divine retribution. The only cure, repentance and fasting. Nothing like a pounding headache and a slice of day-old bread to remind you of your moral failings. Honestly, most people probably didn't call it a hangover. They just called it Thursday. So make no mistake, getting wasted in the Middle Ages had consequences. The difference is, you couldn't just tweet about it or go viral for your shame. You had to dust off the ale crust, hope the local gossip moved on to juicier stories, and quietly plot your next visit to the tavern, maybe with a little more moderation, or at least a better hiding spot. Now, as we stagger out of the tavern, nursing a throbbing head and a bruised sense of dignity, you might wonder, how did all this revelry, bar brawling, and creative hangover cures shape the rules and roles of medieval society? Well, don't sober up yet. In our next stop, we'll dive straight into bar fights, explore the roles women played in booze culture, and examine the medical miracles, or, in some cases, disasters, that emerged from medieval drinking. Because, let's be honest, at some point in history, someone invented alcohol. And then, things got really interesting. Picture yourself standing in the doorway of a medieval tavern. The smell hits you first. A heady mix of wood smoke, spilled ale, roasting meat, and the unmistakable tang of too many unwashed bodies packed into one low-ceilinged room. Before you even have time to take it all in, a mug whizzes past your head and shatters against the wall, spraying two bickering peasants with what's left of someone's dinner ale. Welcome, honored time traveler, to the medieval bar fight, where your chances of leaving with all your teeth depend entirely on your luck, your reflexes, and whether you accidentally insulted someone's sheep. Taverns in the Middle Ages weren't the cozy, candlelit pubs you see in fantasy movies. No. These places throbbed with noise, laughter, singing, shouting, and the occasional crash as a chair met an unfortunate end. Every bench was crowded with people who had just spent the day hauling stones, hammering horseshoes, or arguing with the local tax collector. By nightfall, everyone wanted to let off steam, and sometimes letting off steam meant throwing punches because someone spilled your drink or because a dice game turned sour, or simply because you suspected the guy at the next table of being from the next village over, which might as well have been a foreign country. You could be in the thick of it for almost any reason. Maybe your beard wasn't bushy enough, or your ox looked at someone the wrong way, or you had the audacity to hum a tune that sounded a bit too continental. And about those rules, weapons were officially banned inside taverns. Sure, and I'm the Pope. Daggers, clubs, and even the occasional battered sword found their way in, tucked under tunics or leaning carelessly against the wall. The ban on weapons worked about as well as those "no smoking" signs did. In your uncle's favorite bar in the 1990s, everyone pretended to obey, but nobody actually did. And if you didn't have a weapon, no worries. The tankards were so thick you could use one as a shield, and the stools doubled nicely as battering rams. Sometimes it was just a quick scuffle, one shout, a shove, a spilled pint, and it was over. Other times, the whole place erupted into chaos, with tables upturned and the tavern keeper standing in the doorway, arms crossed, mentally tallying how many chairs he'd have to repair in the morning. The local authorities, those tireless enforcers of order, generally didn't bother themselves unless things got truly out of hand. A couple of laborers trading punches in the corner? That was just a regular Friday. But let a nobleman get a bruise, or a visiting merchant lose a tooth, and suddenly the sheriff was in, stocks were dusted off, and fines were handed out like festival bread. Getting banned from the tavern wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was social exile. Suddenly, you were that sad soul drinking cold ale alone at home, while everyone else swapped stories about your spectacularly bad night. And yet, brawling wasn't just tolerated, it was part of the culture. You walked in for a drink and a laugh, and if fortune frowned on you, walked out with a black eye, a swelling lip, and a story you'd have to edit before telling your grandmother. The tavern was a place to forget your troubles, or, if you preferred, to find a few new ones. But here's something you probably didn't expect. Medieval drinking culture wasn't just a boys' club, not by a long shot. If you ever bought ale from a stall on the corner, or from a jug passed through a kitchen window, chances were high that a woman brewed it, sold it, and, if your mouth ran faster than your sense, might pour it over your head with a flourish. Enter the legendary alewife, the unsung backbone of medieval booze. Alewives were everywhere. Brewing was considered household work, just like baking bread or churning butter. Except your efforts could leave the entire village slightly giggly by sunset. These women brewed in small batches at home, selling their ale from windows, doorsteps, or makeshift counters in the street. Some operated out of their kitchens. Others ran what were known as tippling houses, tiny, informal ale shops where you could buy a quick pint before heading back to your chores. And then there were the few who got ambitious and opened full-fledged alehouses, complete with creaky benches and a regular clientele of thirsty regulars. Of course, there were risks. Brewing laws changed faster than the weather. One year, the inspector wanted your ale strong. The next, it had to be weak enough for a bishop's breakfast. Overcharge, water down your brew, or sell something that made the butcher see double and try to arm wrestle a chicken, and you could wind up fined, shamed, or, my personal favorite, forced to wear a giant paper hat that declared you a bad brewer. Try living that down at the next village festival. Inside the taverns, you'd meet the equally tough tavern maids. Their daily grind involved pouring drinks, wiping up spills, and fending off advances from men with more ambition than teeth. These women had nerves of steel and a vocabulary that could wither crops. Some just wanted to earn a living. Others flirted their way to better tips. A lucky few landed a wealthy patron, married him, and retired early, presumably to a cottage with fewer drunkards and a better view. Let's not forget, women weren't just serving. Sometimes they were celebrating. Weddings, festivals, or simply surviving a week with 8 children and a goat that refused to be milked could all provide an excuse for women to drink. Sure, drunkenness wasn't exactly applauded in women, but neither was it unheard of. And if the night was long and the ale flowed freely, you might hear a few verses of a bawdy song echoing from the kitchen, sung by voices that knew all too well the value of a good drink at the end of a hard day. Now, let's talk about medicine, medieval style. If you were sick, sad, or just looked a little pale, someone was going to hand you alcohol. Maybe it was your local priest, your barber surgeon, or your grandmother with her secret stash of herbal remedies. The medieval answer to almost anything was, "Here, have a drink." And to be fair, sometimes it helped. Not because alcohol actually cured much, but because when you're shaking with fever or your leg is throbbing from a poorly judged jousting match, a few cups of wine can take the edge off and, at the very least, make you less likely to notice the leeches. Doctors, using that term as generously as possible, regularly prescribed wine or ale for just about anything. Got a cold? Try warm wine. Headache? Wine with mint. Digestive troubles? Here, have some mead mixed with herbs, served in what looks suspiciously like a hollowed-out turnip. Even the monks got in on the act, brewing potent herbal liqueurs that would knock you flat and call it healing. These were syrupy, sweet, and flavored with anything that looked vaguely like medicine. We'd call that a digestive today. Back then, they just hoped it didn't kill you before the fever did. One particularly daring cure involved soaking herbs in brandy and downing the lot, supposedly to cleanse the humors. Whether it cleaned anything other than your dignity is up for debate. But you did stop complaining, either because you felt better or because you fell off your stool and passed out. On the battlefield, alcohol found a more practical use. It was one of the few disinfectants available, and it doubled as an anesthetic. Picture this. You're lying on a table, a blacksmith-turned-surgeon looming over you, with a saw that looks like it's seen more wood than flesh. Before he starts, you're handed a mug of something so strong it could strip the paint off a shield. It burns all the way down, and by the time the sawing starts, you're either numb, unconscious, or too distracted to care. Sometimes the doctor needed a drink more than the patient. Alcohol was prescribed for melancholy, plague symptoms, childbirth recovery, and even spiritual malaise. If you were breathing, someone had a bottle for you. Did it work? Occasionally. Did it backfire spectacularly? Oh, absolutely. But in an age where bloodletting was still considered cutting-edge science and leeches were practically family members, a stiff drink was at least a pleasantly numbing mistake. Now, let's follow the money. Medieval Europe's love affair with alcohol wasn't just about celebration or survival. It was big business. Brewing, Selling and serving ale created jobs, supported families, and, perhaps most importantly, gave local officials endless opportunities to write tedious regulations. Some towns even employed ale conners, whose job was to test every batch of beer to make sure it was strong enough, legal enough, and frothy enough. If you're thinking that sounds like the world's best side hustle, just remember, after the 10th bad brew, gout sets in and the fun's over. Taverns needed licenses to operate. In some places that meant a stamped document nailed above the door. In others, it was a handshake with the bailiff and a discreet sack of onions slipped under the table. If you dared to serve ale without permission, you risked fines, public shaming, or a closure so swift it would make a modern health inspector weep tears of envy. And then there were the price controls. Authorities posted official prices for ale on wooden boards, and anyone caught overcharging risked a penalty. In theory, anyway. In practice, if your ale was good enough and your cousin happened to work for the mayor, you could get away with charging a little extra. Medieval nepotism at its finest. But the crown jewel of medieval regulation was the tax. Ale tax, wine tax, malt tax. If it could be brewed, someone figured out how to tax it. In some regions, they even taxed the drinking vessels. Imagine being fined for drinking out of a cup that looked a little too fancy. This was medieval capitalism, where ingenuity met bureaucracy in a never-ending tug-of-war. Naturally, monasteries and nobles often got tax exemptions, because nothing says divinely inspired, like getting drunk on untaxed mead while the peasants paid up. Meanwhile, ordinary folk were stuck paying levies on every batch they brewed, for weddings or family gatherings, even if it tasted like regret. But the more the authorities tried to regulate and tax alcohol, the more creative people became. Some taverns operated on the sly, others sold ale off the record, and a few simply bribed the right official and hoped no one inspected the books too closely. The result? A booming black market in booze, built on loopholes, gossip, and the universal desire to end the day with a decent pint. Alcohol wasn't just a social glue, it was an economic engine. And business, as they say, was booming. By the time the Middle Ages limped to a close, the drinking scene had started to change. Slowly, subtly, and with far fewer pigs wandering through the bar, new trends emerged. Stronger drinks arrived on the scene, thanks to the magic of distillation. Wine could now be transformed into something so potent it doubled as both disinfectant and memory eraser. Early versions of brandy, aquavitae, and water of life appeared, making beer seem like child's play. Trade with distant lands brought in exotic spices, new brewing tricks, and eventually sugar, which paved the way for rum and other sweet spirits. Every shipload of imports nudged local drinking habits in new directions. Mead and ale, once the drinks of choice for everyone from peasants to princes, began to lose ground to imported wines and spirits, especially among the rich, who now sipped their claret and practiced their best Renaissance scowls. Taverns themselves started to evolve. By the 16th century, some morphed into inns and public houses, the ancestors of the modern pub. Drinking wasn't just something you did after work. It became part of travel, politics, even mail delivery. Yes, medieval mailmen drank on the job. Just imagine your local postal worker, tipsy and humming a tune, dropping letters in the wrong village. But then came the Reformation, and with it, a flood of guilt and stern lectures. Reformers like Calvin and Knox were about as fun at parties as a bucket of cold water. Suddenly, drinking was under moral scrutiny. Taverns were accused of being dens of sin, laziness, and questionable lute playing. Licensing laws multiplied, taxes soared, and public drunkenness became a punishable offense. But did that stop anyone? Not really. The desire for a good drink simply found new ways to survive. Alewives were pushed aside by brewing guilds and larger commercial breweries. Wine was regulated by government officials. Spirits became all the rage at court. Gradually, drinking shifted from a daily necessity to a social option, something you chose rather than something you needed to survive. So, as the curtain falls on the Middle Ages, what are we left with? Cleaner water, fewer pigs in bars, and a collective amnesia about just how central alcohol once was to staying alive, throwing a party, or just making it through another week of medieval chaos. But don't get too comfortable in your time-traveling boots. Our next stop veers away from the chaos of the tavern and into the strange, shadowy world of ancient love magic. Because in ancient Babylon, love was not a spontaneous, rosy-cheeked affair. It was an enterprise that could be as calculated and as risky as a medieval bar brawl. Step this way, VIP time traveler, and prepare yourself for a whirlwind, romantic tour like no other. Forget candle-lit dinners and red roses. Tonight, we're plunging into incense. Choked corridors where passion was less a matter of poetry and more a full-contact sport involving gods, demons, and enough bodily fluids to make a modern bartender weep. Consider this your backstage pass to the world's most awkward and occasionally terrifying first dates, where a simple "be mine" could involve grave dirt, animal hearts, and the occasional curse to make your rival's breath reek like a sarcophagus. Let's start in Babylon, where the concept of romance was about as subtle as a war chariot at a tea party. Here, love was an outright campaign, and if you wanted someone to notice you, you didn't just shoot them a flirtatious glance. You called on an army of otherworldly allies. Imagine you're a lovesick Babylonian, pacing the sun-baked streets with a clay figurine tucked beneath your cloak. Maybe you've carved your beloved's name into its chest, or perhaps you're feeling particularly vengeful and inscribed your rival's name instead. Either way, your plan is simple. Bury that figurine near their doorstep, whisper a few words to a scowling demon, and let supernatural leverage do the rest. Who needs a bouquet when you've got necromancy on speed dial? In the flickering torchlight of the local temple, a priestess, let's call her the original relationship coach, chants feverishly to Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. Ishtar, by the way, is not the type to dish out gentle advice. She once obliterated an entire mountain range because her boyfriend dumped her. Talk about setting the bar for dramatic breakups. So when you invoke Ishtar, you're not just asking for butterflies in your stomach. You're unleashing cosmic forces that can tip the scales between longing and lunacy. The rituals themselves are tactile and visceral. Hair, nail clippings, and even drops of blood become more than just traces of a person. They're mystical tethers, organic tokens burned in sacred fires, dissolved into fragrant oils, or wrapped into tight little bundles. These bundles are then hidden beneath doorways or pressed under mattresses, designed to heat the heart of your target to boiling, sometimes to the point of obsession, sometimes straight into madness. But Babylonian love magic wasn't only about sparking passions. It was equally adept at snuffing them out. Got an unwanted admirer or a rival who's stealing your thunder? There's a spell for that. One particularly creative Babylonian charm involved asking the gods to make a rival's breath as foul as a decomposing corpse. Imagine your nemesis leaning in for a moonlit kiss and sending the object of their desire fleeing for fresh air. Subtle, no, but heartbreak is rarely gentle. Every tryst, every rivalry, every desperate hope became a battle in a theater of ash, honey, blood, and whispered incantations. You didn't simply wish for someone's affection. You dragged them into a spiritual tug-of-war, with scrolls, dolls, and invisible spirits acting as your very enthusiastic, somewhat unhinged cheerleaders. In Babylon, love was never a gentle meeting of souls. It was an act of will, a contest where the loser might find themselves muttering someone else's name in their sleep, or just, drooling uncontrollably. And when charm failed, the Babylonians reached for their spellbooks, etching incantations in cuneiform, murmuring prayers to the stars, and sealing their hopes with puffs of sacred smoke. It might not have been pure, but it was potent. Babylonian romance, after all, left no room for ambiguity or half measures. Now, dust the cinders from your sandals and fast forward to ancient Greece, where love magic ditches subtlety in favor of drama and domination. Here, the Greeks had a word for the frenzied, all-consuming madness that came with magical infatuation, eros. But don't let the poetic name fool you. This was not the stuff of gentle verses or blushing maidens. Eros in Greek magic was a fever, a fire that could drive the victim to sleeplessness, hallucinations, and the occasional public breakdown in the middle of an olive grove. In this world, love spells divided into two main categories, agoge spells and philia spells. If you're a man desperate to make someone crawl, yes, the actual spell says crawling, into your arms, you would choose agoge. Think of it as the magical equivalent of a Tinder super-like, but with more graveyards and lead tablets. Agoge spells weren't shy about their intent. The spellcaster would inscribe their desire on a strip of lead, scrawl out a command for the target's heart to burn, and then bury the tablet in a graveyard or toss it into a well. These weren't just convenient hiding spots. They were portals to the underworld, ideal if you're hoping to recruit a bold ghost to do your romantic bidding. After all, what's a restless spirit to do with eternity but meddle in mortal affairs? On the flip side, philia spells were the preferred tool of women hoping to keep their husbands loyal, or at least less distracted by every passing nymph. Rather than inciting wild passion, philia aimed for harmony and gentle affection. Think magical marriage counseling, but with fewer awkward silences and more wine. These spells often slipped into daily life, disguised in wine or oil, acting as tranquilizers for the wandering heart. If you've ever wondered why your spouse insists on that nightly herbal tea, maybe double-check the ingredient list. Of course, the Greeks had a flair for the dramatic when it came to ingredients. Mandrake root, with its vaguely human shape and legendary scream when uprooted, was a favorite aphrodisiac. Not exactly a bouquet of roses, but who's counting? Honey and myrrh sweetened the mix, while crushed bones added a certain je ne sais quoi. Some spells called for menstrual blood, believed to bind a lover's soul permanently. Forget romantic poetry. This was the ancient equivalent of a legally binding contract, signed in bodily fluids. Greek erotic magic was never about mutual consent or gentle affection. It was a chess game, one where the pieces could scream, bleed, or drive you to madness. The god of love, Eros, was depicted blindfolded and armed with arrows for a reason. Love wasn't just blind, it was weaponized. In the hands of a desperate Greek, it could be as dangerous as a poisoned cup of wine at a symposium. Marching onward, we arrive in Rome, where the Greek's playbook gets a splash of wine, a dash of politics, and a lot more legal ambiguity. In Rome, love spells weren't just the province of heartbroken villagers. They were tools of influence, subtle weapons in the endless skirmish for social status and family power. If you couldn't win someone's affection the old-fashioned way, well, you might just rewrite fate itself, preferably after consulting a lawyer. The Romans' favorite magical maneuver was the defixio, or binding spell. Imagine yourself hunched over a candle at midnight, scratching a desperate message onto a thin sheet of lead. These curses could read like a legal summons, or, on a slow night, like overwrought fan fiction. Let Victrix burn with love for me, Marcus, day and night, like a torch, until she can't bear to be apart. Romantic, until you realize Marcus buried the spell next to a child's grave for extra potency. Nothing says, "Be mine." Like leveraging the restless dead, Roman love magic wasn't limited to written words. Potions and perfumes played a starring role. Women anointed themselves, or their targets, with mixes laced with vervain, mint, and, if you were feeling risky, belladonna. A fragrant encounter might be more than an attempt at seduction. It could be a covert magical operation. And then there was Venus wine, a notorious love potion rumored to contain animal parts, rare herbs, and, yes, bodily fluids. Slaves and courtesans were known to slip this into their masters' drinks, hoping to tip the power balance. If the potion didn't work, at least the hangover might make the master more pliable. Offer Venus wine at a modern bar, and see how many people make it to last call. The law in Rome, always ready to rain on a magical parade, treated love magic not as a crime of passion, but as a public menace. It was all fun and games, until someone cursed a senator into celibacy and threw off inheritance plans. For the Romans, love was political, magical, and just a little bit toxic, exactly the way they seemed to like it. Now, take a deep, perfumed breath and follow me to ancient Egypt, where love wasn't just a game or a power play, it was a sacred rite. Dangerous only in the hands of those who knew which levers to pull. Egyptian love spells were equal parts poetry, devotion, and ruthless manipulation. Forget teenage heartbreak scribbled in a diary. These spells were meticulously composed, written in red ink on papyrus, and sanctioned by gods like Hathor, Isis, and Bes. Breakups in Egypt didn't end with tears. They ended with conjurations. Here, magic was a blend of the metaphorical and the physical. Picture a spellcaster summoning a deity to invade the dreams of their target, whispering lines like, "You long for her as the desert longs for rain." Beautiful, poetic, and a little bit terrifying. One papyrus from the Ptolemaic period describes a spell that turns the target's heart into a bird fluttering in a cage, restless until reunited with the spellcaster. Just to drive the point home, the Egyptians would often include tiny drawings of bound figures or birds with clipped wings in case the gods were in need of visual aids. But Egyptian love magic wasn't content to leave things in the realm of dreams and metaphors. Wax figurines, shaped to resemble both the spellcaster and the object of their affection, were anointed with scented oils, stabbed with needles, or sealed in jars etched with love formulas. Depending on the desired outcome, passion or payback, the treatments varied. Want devotion? Rub the doll with lotus oil. Nursing a grudge? Add a touch of scorpion venom. Potions were a popular choice too, often brewed from honey, wine, mandrake root, and, you guessed it, blood. Menstrual blood mixed with beer was believed to bind a man's soul to the woman in a union that was, let's say, more than skin deep. Try ordering that at your next happy hour and see how your bartender reacts. What truly set Egyptian love spells apart was their divine undertone. These weren't cheap tricks, they were cosmic negotiations. Love and lust were seen as extensions of divine will, but with the right mixture of hymns, words, and enchanted amulets, even the will of the gods could, apparently, be nudged. The ingredients straddled the line between medicine, magic, and outright poison, blurring boundaries that would make a modern pharmacist faint. You weren't wooing someone with flowers and chocolates. You were dosing them with hallucinogens, animal parts, and, occasionally, a bit of yourself. If you think modern dating is a minefield, be grateful it rarely requires powdered mummy. So, as we brush the last grains of enchanted dust from our robes, let's pause and appreciate the sheer inventiveness and utter weirdness of ancient love magic. Whether you were a Babylonian whispering curses into the night, a Greek scribbling on lead in a graveyard, a Roman spiking the wine with questionable herbs, or an Egyptian weaving the will of the gods, you were playing with fire. Sometimes it burned bright with passion. Sometimes it just left a lingering smell of grave dirt. Now, before you rush off to try these tricks at your next singles mixer, let's take a closer look at what went into these spells. In ancient love magic, ingredients weren't chosen for their smell or taste. Let's take a stroll through the shadowy bazaar of ancient love spells, where the selection of ingredients is all about raw, supernatural clout. Imagine you're an apprentice sorcerer in Babylon, shopping for the perfect ingredient to make someone fall head over heels, or perhaps just fall, period. Forget roses and chocolates. You're reaching for tufts of hair, fingernail clippings, saliva, and yes, even menstrual blood. It might sound like the world's worst cooking show, but each of these items was believed to hold a piece of the person's soul. To bind a lover, you didn't just need their affection, you needed a physical, personal fragment, a little piece of their essence that you could twist, burn, or bury as needed. But the ancient magical grocery list didn't stop at the local barber shop's floor sweepings. Sometimes, spells called for ingredients so rare or so downright terrifying that you start to wonder if ancient magicians were just trying to outdo each other for shock value. Picture yourself in the markets of Babylon, clutching a shopping list that includes scraps of lion skin, a dollop of crocodile fat, or a handful of feathers plucked from an owl that only comes out when the moon is full. Animals that lived at the edge of the human world, in darkness or danger, were believed to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. In Egypt, your friendly neighborhood love magician might offer you an amulet smeared with scorpion venom and myrrh, an aromatic blend to inspire both desire and a healthy dose of mortal terror. The Romans, never ones to shy away from a little macabre flair, sometimes tossed in the ashes of the condemned or bits of burned bone. If you couldn't win love among the living, why not borrow a little help from the restless dead? One Greek spell, apparently written by someone with a flair for both poetry and horror, prescribed mixing bat bones with honey and wine, then setting the mixture beneath a statue of Aphrodite under the full moon. Drink it, and your beloved would go mad with longing. Of course, there was always the risk they'd just go mad, period. Love potions at this level started to look suspiciously like poison, with belladonna, mandrake, and henbane all making regular appearances. In the right dose, these herbs might make someone feel giddy and vulnerable. In the wrong dose, well, let's just say the afterlife might get a new arrival, an eternal union, tombstone included. While ancient men often favored spells that cranked up the heat, think lust potions and frenzied obsessions, women were the masters of the subtle arts. Forget boiling cauldrons and thunderclaps. Many enchantresses worked their magic through clothing, food, or tiny packets of fragrant herbs sewn into charm bags. These little bundles could be hidden in pillows or dangled beneath beds, working their magic in secret with every breath and touch. One Babylonian recipe recommended anointing the breasts with sacred oil before embracing a lover, turning the most intimate moments into a spellbinding ritual, equal parts seduction and sorcery. But not every spell was Cupid's arrow. Some were daggers, hidden beneath a velvet cloak of sweet words. Ancient love magic had a dark side, full of curses disguised as passion. It wasn't always about mutual longing. Sometimes it was about control, humiliation, or straight-up vengeance. In Greece and Rome, many spells that pretended to be about love were actually binding curses, diffictiones, meant to overwhelm, dominate, and even ruin the victim. On the surface, they might sound like love letters. May she think of no other man but me. But the fine print reveals a psychological hostage situation. The preferred method for these spells was brutal simplicity. The idea was to break a person's will, to make them sleepless, haunted, and obsessed. Imagine someone praying not just for your heart, but for your arms, legs, tongue, and even your most personal bits to be bound by the gods until you came crawling back in utter desperation. These curses were often scratched onto lead tablets, carefully folded to seal the victim's fate, then dropped into graves, wells, or crossroads, those spooky, in-between places where the world of the living and the world of the divine overlapped. In one particularly unsettling Roman example, the spellcaster begs the god Pluto to drive a woman to madness unless she seeks out the magician in the streets. The spell doesn't stop there. It gets specific, demanding. Bind her knees so she cannot dance with another. Bind her lips so she cannot kiss another. this wasn't romance. It was emotional abduction, complete with ghostly henchmen lurking in the shadows. Sometimes these enchanted power plays included a second victim, the rival. In that case, the spell became a 2-for-1 special. All the passion is diverted to the spellcaster, while the competitor is left to rot, literally and figuratively. One spell from Carthage curses a rival woman with hair loss, a decaying voice, and womb sickness. A medieval version of the ultimate block and report. In Egypt, love curses were often poetic, but just as ruthless. Invoking lion-headed deities, spellcasters would demand that the target's peace of mind be torn to shreds until they surrendered. Sometimes, a little figurine of the victim would be stabbed, burned, or broken, while the caster recited the binding words, voodoo dolls, but with a flair for dramatic verse. And yet, for all the cryptic rituals and midnight grave visits, ancient love magic didn't always lurk in the shadows. Much of it was woven seamlessly into everyday life, hidden in plain sight. For many people, casting a love spell was about as routine as brushing your hair or pouring a glass of wine, just another part of the daily grind. Magic wasn't a separate reality. It was the spice mixed into the stew of ordinary existence. Picture yourself wandering through a bustling market in Athens or Babylon. The vendors hawk figs, perfumes, and, tucked among the trinkets, magical charms. These amulets, made from carnelian, hematite, or bronze, might be shaped like phalluses or tiny hands, or ever-watchful eyes. Worn in a tunic or sewn into a hem, they could attract affection or shield against unwanted advances, depending on your romantic strategy. A hopeful girl might slip one on before heading out to catch a suitor's eye. A suspicious wife might hide one under the mattress to keep her husband loyal and his wandering eye firmly grounded. Love magic also simmered in kitchen pots. Meals weren't just seasoned for flavor. They were laced with intention. Roman women were notorious for slipping aphrodisiacs into sauces, pouring wine sweetened with honey and herbs, or kneading bread while whispering enchanted wishes. In Egypt, a charm advised the cook to breathe into the pot and speak the beloved's name 3 times, infusing every bite with a dash of desire. Dinner became a slow, edible seduction, each mouthful a tiny incantation, each swallow a step further under the spell. Even the ancient beauty routine was a magical affair. Greek women would grind rare herbs into their eyeshadows and lip pigments, believing that a well-cast gaze could ensnare the heart. A spell from the Hellenistic era advised reciting hymns to Aphrodite while applying rouge, transforming the simple act of putting on makeup into a sacred moment of transformation. Clothing, too, was fair game for enchantment. Babylonian texts suggest washing a shirt in enchanted water before gifting it to a would-be lover. If the recipient wore it, the spell was said to grip them like a net. These weren't grand theatrical rituals. They were intimate, subtle performances, staged in kitchens, bedrooms, and bathhouses. Love magic belonged to everyone, not just desperate wizards or vengeful aristocrats. Of course, for all their seductive promises, ancient love spells came with fine print, and not the kind you could ignore. Success was never guaranteed, and the consequences were often as unpredictable as a modern blind date. While spellcasters dreamed of blissful unions, the historical record is crammed with cautionary tales and dire warnings. The very spell meant to bind a lover could just as easily unleash illness, madness, or the wrath of the gods. Philosophers and priests in Greece and Rome were quick to warn against dabbling in love magic. Theophrastus had a field day mocking spell users, painting them as gullible fools doomed to disappointment. Pliny the Elder, the original fact-checker, dismissed love magic as dangerous superstition, warning that practitioners were either deluded or criminal, or both. Even the magical papyri included ominous disclaimers: "Do not call upon this spirit unless you are ready to accept what follows." The ancient equivalent of, "By reading this, you agree to the terms and conditions," which may include spiritual bankruptcy. Sometimes what followed was downright grotesque. There's a Roman legend of a man driven mad by a love spell gone awry, doomed to wander the city at night, calling out the name of a woman he no longer recognized. Another story tells of a woman who dosed her husband with a fidelity potion, only to find herself the object of his dangerous obsession. He became violent and paranoid, convinced she was unfaithful in spite of her original intentions. Some spells even warned, "If she is not meant to love you, your heart shall know sorrow tenfold." That's ancient for, don't force it, or the universe will absolutely ruin your week. And let's not forget, rivals could, and often did, fight back. If a woman suspected she was the target of a spell, she might hire her own magician to break the enchantment or send a curse in return. These magical feuds could escalate into what can only be described as hex wars, with spells ricocheting through the community for years. Salt circles, protective charms, and sacred incantations became the magical version of locking your door and changing your passwords. Perhaps the most unsettling part of all, when love spells worked, the result was far more often obsession than affection. The victim might become obsessed, yes, but not truly connected. It wasn't passion, it was compulsion, a haunting echo of what love should be. And yet, even though the gods of Babylon have gone silent and the Roman curse tablets have crumbled into dust, the pulse of ancient love magic still beats through our world. It's just adapted. The old spells and rituals have been rebranded as folk traditions, whispered superstitions, or even the self-help rituals making the rounds on TikTok. Just look at the modern love potion. Science may scoff, but walk into any health store, and you'll find shelves groaning with tonics promising to boost attraction, deepen intimacy, or unlock that mysterious spark. Herbs like mandrake, damiana, and ginseng still find their way into teas and oils, promising to heat up your love life. No necromancy required. In southern Italy, grandmothers still tie red ribbons under mattresses, hide herbal sachets in clothing, and whisper charms that would have made a Roman magician proud. In parts of the Middle East and North Africa, echoes of Egyptian love magic survive in discreet talismans and kitchen spells, passed down through generations. Even pop culture can't resist the pull of a love spell gone wrong. Movies, songs, and novels are packed with enchanted lovers, bewitched potions, and that all too familiar theme: when you try to force love, chaos follows close behind. It's the same warning the ancients issued: bottle up desire at your own risk. Modern psychology, meanwhile, has started to uncover the science behind what those ancient spellcasters were up to. Mirroring body language, using scent to trigger memory, timing a confession for maximum effect, Were these ancient magic tricks, or just proto-hacks dressed up with a little divine drama? The line gets blurrier the longer you look. And yes, love spells are still for sale, now with pastel colors and crystal emojis. Etsy shops offer customized candle rituals, while social media is packed with manifestation tutorials that could have come straight from a Greek papyrus, just with better lighting. In the end, ancient love magic was never really about making someone fall for you. It was about seizing a little control in the wild, helpless mess of longing. That urge to be seen, to be chosen, to feel like love isn't just luck, but something you can summon, remains stubbornly, beautifully human. If a little magic helps, most people are still willing to try. So, as we leave behind the smoky kitchens and shadowy bedrooms of the ancient world, let's brush the last specks of enchanted powder from our sleeves. Our next stop will take us into the roaring arenas and sacred stadiums of the past, where love and longing take a back seat to the thunder of feet and the clash of bodies. Step into the dust and sunlight of ancient Greece with me, your personal chaperone, through the wildest, sweatiest, and most gloriously unwashed corners of history. Here, sport wasn't about killing an afternoon or burning off the wine and cheese from last night's symposium. No, for the Greeks, athletics were a sacred obligation, a flexing, grunting act of worship performed for the gods themselves, with all the subtlety of a divine flex-off. Picture yourself in Olympia, 776 years before the Common Era, when the very first Olympic Games kicked off under the stony gaze of Zeus. Forget politics, forget war. This was the only occasion when Greek city-states would call a truce, just to send their best and boldest to the arena. Imagine thousands of men, skin bronzed and muscles gleaming, gathering not just to compete, but to chase the closest thing to immortality a mortal could hope for, undying fame. But let's clear up a common misconception right away. If you're picturing athletes in pristine robes, tossing discs with the wind billowing at their backs, think again. The Greeks believed in radical transparency, literally. Athletes competed completely nude, not even a fig leaf for modesty. It was a double whammy, a celebration of the ideal male form, and a not-so-subtle way to prove no one was hiding a horseshoe in their tunic. No tricks, no armor. Just pure muscle and sweat on full display. If the gods were watching, you'd better believe they got the full show. Before stepping onto the sand, every competitor swore a solemn oath to Zeus himself, promising honesty and fair play. This wasn't just ceremonial lip service. Break the oath, and you could face public flogging or be booted out in disgrace. In a world where reputation meant everything, the threat of humiliation was more terrifying than a stray javelin to the thigh. Training wasn't for the faint of heart. These athletes weren't weekend warriors. They dedicated months, sometimes years, to perfecting their bodies and their craft, usually under the eagle-eyed supervision of coaches, priests, and, occasionally, philosophers who would remind them that wrestling naked was the highest form of virtue, platonically speaking, of course. The events themselves were as raw and elemental as you can get. The original lineup was a greatest hits of pain and glory, foot races that tested speed and endurance, the long jump, discus, javelin, wrestling, and boxing. Then, For those who thought regular violence was too tame, there was the pancration, a brutal mashup of wrestling and boxing with barely a rule in sight. Fingers were snapped, eyes poked, and the crowd roared for more. Death was rare, but not exactly discouraged. If you croaked on the sand, well, you'd just given the gods a better show. For the victors, the rewards were at once humble and extravagant. You might be crowned with a humble olive wreath, but when you returned home, you were treated like a demigod. Cities would offer free meals for life, tickets to the best theatre seats, or even a get-out-of-taxes free card. Poets sang your praises, sculptors immortalized your physique in marble, and for a brief, shining moment, you could strut the agora like you owned the place. But don't expect a co-ed after-party. The ancient Olympics were a men-only affair, no women allowed, not even in the stands. The only exception was a separate festival for young women, the Haraya, featuring foot races for unmarried girls at the same sacred site. Still, it was a side note compared to the testosterone-fueled main event. Equality was not on the program. The Greek Olympics weren't just games. They were a holy blaze of ambition, discipline, and the ever-present desire to leave your mark on history. This was athleticism as ritual, competition as legacy, and war stripped of weapons, but not of sweat or ego. Now, let's shift gears dramatically. If the Greeks turned sport into a sacred pageant, the Romans dialed the spectacle up to 11, then soaked it in blood. Welcome to the Roman Empire, where athletics meant violence, and the crowd wanted more than just a good show. They wanted carnage. The gladiatorial games were the ultimate Roman entertainment, and subtlety was not on the menu. Imagine the Colosseum, Rome's colossal amphitheater, packed with 50,000 spectators. The air is thick with the scent of sweat, fear, and roasted mystery meat on a stick. Admission is free, courtesy of emperors and politicians desperate for public approval. Bread and circuses, folks, keep the mob fed and wowed, and they'll ignore your tax fraud and imperial overreach. Unlike the Greeks, the Romans weren't interested in celebrating the beauty of the human form, so much as testing how much punishment it could take. Gladiators, usually slaves, prisoners of war, or the unlucky victims of Roman legal innovation, were trained in special schools called ludi. Here men, and, though it was rare, sometimes women, learned not just to fight, but also to perform. The more flamboyant, the better. Bleeding was practically mandatory. Not all gladiators were anonymous fodder. Some became celebrities, like Spartacus, the rebel who became a legend, adored by the masses even as he was forced into the sands for their amusement. Gladiators came in various flavors. Some wielded swords and shields, others cast nets and brandished tridents. Each fighting style had its own costume and flair, designed to keep the crowd guessing and the bookies busy. Don't forget the animal hunts, mock sea battles, and the occasional public execution, just to spice things up. The Colosseum was less a sports arena and more a mashup of theatre, horror show, and reality TV, if the losers on Survivor had to battle lions. But here's where Hollywood gets it wrong. Contrary to the thumbs up, thumbs down myth, most fights didn't end in death. Gladiators were investments, not disposable props. If you lost, you could raise a finger in surrender, and your fate would rest with the editor. the official who owned the games. Killing a well-trained fighter was financially foolish. The thumb gesture. Ancient sources are annoyingly vague, so let's blame that on bad Roman PR and an overzealous film director or two. Even so, some gladiators did achieve rock star status. The public would scrawl graffiti about their favorite fighters' thighs, yes, really, and shower them with gifts or fan letters. Some even won their freedom and retired as trainers, bodyguards, or minor celebrities at the ancient equivalent of Comic-Con. But if you think the Greeks and Romans had a monopoly on strange, sacred sport, let's travel across the world to Mesoamerica, where the ball game, called by its ancient names like Ullamalidisli, was equal parts athletic contest, religious ritual, and cosmic drama. This wasn't a friendly pickup game at the neighborhood court. Here, the stakes were as high as the stone rings players aimed for. Imagine yourself on a ball court shaped like a giant capitol. Its sloping sides decorated with carvings of gods, warriors, and serpentine creatures. The rubber ball is heavy, about 9 pounds if you're counting, and you have to strike it using only your hips, knees, elbows, or thighs. No hands allowed. The goal? Get that ball through a vertical stone ring perched well above your head. Good luck. Scoring was so rare that, in some games, it was enough to end the match on the spot. If you managed it, you'd basically achieved legendary status, think game-winning buzzer beater, but with a lot more religious anxiety. These ball courts weren't playgrounds. They were theaters of cosmic destiny, where players reenacted the eternal struggle between light and darkness, life and death, the gods and the underworld. In Maya mythology, the game retold the story of the hero twins who ventured into the underworld and played against the lords of death themselves. This was performance with a side of existential dread. And here's where things get truly macabre. Not every game ended in ritual sacrifice, but many did, especially those linked to major religious festivals. Who got sacrificed is still up for debate. Some evidence points to the captain of the winning team being honored with a trip to the afterlife, ascending straight to divine favor. Other accounts suggest the losers paid the ultimate price, a public demonstration of cosmic justice. Either way, you did not want to be the one standing in the wrong place at the wrong time when the final whistle blew. The thud of the rubber ball wasn't just a sound effect. It was the heartbeat of belief, echoing through temple plazas and reverberating with every bounce. The ball game was more than entertainment. It was the theater of gods, mortals, and fate, all played out under the unforgiving sun. So, whether you're dodging flying elbows in the nude at Olympia, ducking a trident in the Colosseum, or risking your neck with a rubber ball in the shadow of the temple, one thing becomes clear. Ancient sports were never just games. They were sacred, spectacular, and, at times, terrifying reminders of how deeply people longed to connect with something greater than themselves, even if it meant bleeding, sweating, or occasionally offering up a teammate to the gods. And as we leave behind these arenas of glory, gore, and cosmic drama, our next stop takes us to the banks of the Nile, the royal courts of China, the temples of the Near East, and the bustling fields of South Asia, where sport took on new roles, blending leisure, ritual, and, yes, a little bit of preparation for the afterlife. Step right through this limestone archway with me. Careful. Mind the sand in your sandals. And let's plunge straight into the world of ancient Egyptian athletics. Here, in the land of sun-baked tombs and eyeliner that just won't quit, sport was never just about flexing in front of your neighbors. No. Every leap, grapple, and well-aimed arrow was loaded with cosmic meaning. Imagine you're an Egyptian noble at a festival, garlanded with lotus flowers, when suddenly the wrestling matches kick off. These weren't just sweaty bouts for bragging rights. They were living metaphors for the endless tug-of-war between order and chaos, the very forces that made the Nile flood and the stars align. Picture the scene inside a pharaoh's tomb. On cool plaster walls, painted wrestlers lock arms, executing throws and trips that would make a modern judo sensei do a double take. There's no WWE-style posturing here. Just pure discipline, training, and the kind of balance you need both to keep your feet and to keep the universe from unraveling. Wrestlers trained the king's soldiers and elite guards, but every match was also a cosmic rehearsal. Whenever someone got slammed into the dust, somewhere out in the universe, chaos took a hit. But wrestling was only the opening act. Next, you find yourself in the royal gardens, as the pharaoh himself mounts a chariot. Yes, a proper Ben-Hur setup, minus the Roman accent. He draws his bow, a priest blows a horn, and off he races, loosing arrows at copper rings, while his chariot rattles and careens. This isn't just sport, it's a living PowerPoint presentation. Look at me. I can shoot arrows while standing on a moving platform. The gods love me. Vote Pharaoh. Archery in Egypt was as much about divine approval as it was about hitting the bullseye. Pharaohs who could thread an arrow through a ring didn't just look cool, they looked chosen. Let's slip down to the banks of the Nile, where the air is thick with the scent of river mud and roasted fish. Young men pile into slender wooden boats, gripping oars in sun-browned hands. Rowing regattas in Egypt weren't just about speed, they were ceremonial, synchronized dances with the gods as the ultimate judges. Every stroke was a tribute to the solar journey of Ra, the sun god, who rode his celestial bark across the sky each day, hopefully, without cramping up halfway. Outside the royal circle, sports got a little more, let's say, homegrown. Picture yourself at a village festival. Kids hop through leapfrog games. Laborers flex their muscles in tug-of-war, and everyone sweating through their linen tunics. Even the most mundane games doubled as religious rituals or community glue. Athleticism wasn't just for the elite. It was the way everyone stayed fit enough to haul stones, outlast plagues, and, of course, outdance the neighbors at the next feast. Now, here's a twist most people don't expect. Egyptian women weren't left on the sidelines. Step into a banquet hall, and you'd spot female dancers and gymnasts, their movements fluid and athletic, performing at celebrations of fertility or the arrival of a new season. These weren't Olympic sprints, but they demanded strength, grace, and the kind of stamina that makes modern yoga look like a warm-up. Their performances held real symbolic weight, merging athleticism with the divine feminine, proof that, in Egypt at least, sports could be as much about celebration as competition. Swoosh, we're whisked eastward across deserts and mountains to ancient China, where sport was both a test of skill and a meditation on virtue. Imagine yourself in a grand ceremonial hall, banners fluttering in the incense-thick air, as noblemen line up with bows in hand. Archery here wasn't just a martial art. It was Confucian philosophy in action. Every movement, from the respectful bow to the steady release of the arrow, was prescribed and ritualized. The target wasn't just for show. Hitting it was proof you were on target in life, morally, spiritually, and hopefully not just by dumb luck. But don't get too comfortable in your scholar's robes. The mood shifts as we gallop into the age of jigu, Chinese polo. If you ever thought polo was just for bored British princes, think again. The Tang court loved polo so much that even the emperor strapped on his riding boots. The pace was frantic, the mallets long, and the risks, well, let's just say Emperor Shang found out the hard way that horses don't check for royal status before bucking you off. Yet, what really raised eyebrows was the sight of noble women thundering alongside men, silk robes flying, smashing balls with the best of them. For a brief, glorious moment, gender lines on the field blurred, and the sidelines filled with scandalized aunts and admiring poets. Meanwhile, out on the training grounds, soldiers and peasants alike kicked leather balls in a game called kuju, the ancient ancestor of soccer. The ball was real, the nets were crude, and the bragging afterwards was eternal. Originally designed as military training to keep soldiers nimble, kuju eventually spread to city streets and muddy fields, becoming the world's oldest documented form of football. So next time you see a red card, remember, 2,000 years ago, the only penalty was try not to get trampled. Martial arts also flourished. Early forms of kung fu and wrestling weren't just about breaking boards or egos. They were spiritual drills, forging the body into a vessel of harmony. Public sparring matches during festivals drew crowds that cheered not just for bruises, but for displays of balance, self-control, and a touch of theatrical flair. Even games like chess and Go were considered sports. After all, it took just as much stamina to outwit a rival over a board as to hold a wrestling hold for 10 minutes. The ideal competitor was balanced, disciplined, and as likely to recite poetry as to throw a punch. Now, let's take a sharp left turn, down the ziggurat steps and into the ancient Near East, where sports had a distinctly iron-fisted flavor. Here, athleticism was the preserve of kings, soldiers, and anyone eager to prove that the gods were on their side. Step into Mesopotamia, and you'll find wrestling everywhere, from epic poems to carved reliefs. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, doesn't just tell the story of a hero. It kicks off with a wrestling match so intense the whole city trembles, and the outcome is a lifelong bromance. Wrestling was more than a pastime. It was a rite of passage, a contest of equals, and the fastest way to make friends or enemies. If you were royalty, being fit wasn't optional. Assyrian kings, not content with merely ruling empires, liked to show off by wrestling lions. Yes, actual lions. These hunts weren't just for sport. They were state-sponsored propaganda with claws. Each slain beast was a message. Chaos, meet order. Order, meet my biceps. The king's physical might was proof he was chosen to keep the universe and his subjects in line. Persia, meanwhile, perfected the blend of athletics, warfare, and ethics. Imagine growing up in the Persian Empire. From the age of 5, you'd be drilled in the 3 sacred skills: riding a horse, drawing a bow, and telling the truth. Archery and equestrian games weren't mere hobbies. They were passports to the elite, badges of honor, and the only way to earn that sweet, sweet royal recognition. At temple festivals, crowds would gather to watch foot races, stone-lifting contests, and ceremonial fights. The stakes weren't just personal glory. Every event was a public spectacle, designed to remind everyone that the health of the body was inseparable from the health of the city and the cosmos itself. But not every contest involves sweating through your tunic. The Near East gave us the world's first documented board games, such as the Royal Game of where rulers and priests matched wits in battles of chance and strategy. These games weren't just for passing the time. They were seen as contests of fate, divination tools, and, occasionally, excuses to settle arguments without calling in the royal wrestlers. Fast forward, or more accurately, fast sidestep to South Asia. Let's stroll through the wide, organized streets of Harappa or Mohenjo-daro, cities so meticulously planned they make modern urban designers weep. Here, athletic culture was intimately connected to social hierarchy, ritual, and the pursuit of cosmic balance. While archaeologists haven't turned up any ancient Team Harappa jerseys, they have found terracotta figurines locked in dynamic wrestling poses, dancers frozen mid-twist, and acrobats forever mid-flip. The message is clear. Movement was life, and life was meant to be performed. As society evolved into the Vedic era, physical culture became even more codified. Young nobles and warriors didn't just train for war, they turned martial arts into sacred practice. Dhanurveda, the science of warfare, prescribed rigorous training in archery, swordplay, chariot driving, and good old-fashioned hand-to-hand brawling. Royal festivals often featured competitions where princes would show off their strength, skill, and, if all else failed, their ability to look impressive while pulling a bow. Wrestling, or Malayuddha, wasn't merely about overpowering your opponent. It was a spiritual journey. Wrestlers followed strict diets, adhered to moral codes, and often lived in akharas, part gym, part temple, part monastic fraternity. Training was as much about purifying the mind as perfecting a headlock. These traditions survive in India today, with wrestlers still revered for their discipline and spiritual commitment. Ball games and dice games also had their moment. Sanskrit texts describe everything from animal races to strategy games, all falling under the umbrella of Krida, sport as both play and ritual. Even the gods got in on the action. In the Mahabharata, Krishna and Arjuna aren't just cosmic superheroes, they're athletes. Their sporting prowess, standing in for the eternal struggle between order and chaos. And then, of course, there's yoga. Forget the gentle stretching class at your local gym. Ancient yoga was a no-nonsense physical and mental training regimen designed to mold body and spirit for transcendence, not Instagram. So, as we dust off our feet and leave behind the echoes of ancient cheers, it's clear that in Egypt, China, the Near East, and South Asia, sports were so much more than games. They were rituals, power plays, philosophical experiments, and sometimes the only thing standing between a ruler and a riot. Whether you were a pharaoh seeking cosmic legitimacy, a Chinese noblewoman galloping after a polo ball, or an Indian wrestler contemplating the universe while holding a headlock, you weren't just breaking a sweat for glory. You were participating in the grand, weird theater of human civilization. Speaking of unexpected players in the ancient arena, our next stop takes us deeper into the untold stories. Though often overlooked in historical accounts, women in the ancient world did participate in sports. And, as we'll soon see, their legacies echo all the way from the dusty wrestling pits of antiquity to the shadowy tunnels beneath Paris in the catacombs. Ready for a tour where athletic prowess and the macabre go hand in hand? Let's step briskly onward. Let's step back in time for a moment. No, not to the world of endless artisan bread or the original wine mom, but to a place where the rules of sports weren't just written for men, and where athleticism sometimes meant a whole lot more than chariot races and flying discus. Imagine you're in the ancient world, where the scent of olive oil lingers in the air, the dust of the stadium swirls at your feet, and you, yes, you, are about to witness something historians love to ignore: women actually competing in sports. Not as a rare fluke, not just as cheerleaders in the background, but as powerful, agile, sometimes scandalous athletes in their own right. Now, before you dust off your toga and start chanting Hercules, let's set the record straight. Women's participation in ancient sports was often tangled in a web of restrictions, rituals, and eyebrow-raising double standards. Most public athletic contests were reserved for men, and women were usually shunted into gender-specific spaces or outright banned from the main events. But don't go picturing a world entirely devoid of athletic women. Across the ancient map, from Greece to Egypt, Rome to China, female physical prowess was never entirely absent. Sometimes it was celebrated, sometimes quietly suppressed, but it always found a way to leave its mark. Let's start in ancient Greece, the land of marble statues, philosophical debates, and a sporting culture that practically invented the idea of competitive athletics. Here's a twist for you. Women weren't just forbidden from participating in the Olympic Games. They weren't even allowed in the audience. That's right. If you were a woman in 5th century Greece, forget about box seats at the discus finals. In fact, if you so much as peeked, the penalty could be death. The Greeks really took their no girls allowed policy to the next level. But the Greeks, in all their paradoxical wisdom, invented a loophole. Enter the Heraia, the festival held in honor of Hera, queen of the gods, and, apparently, patron of athletic young women. Picture this, Olympia, the sacred grounds buzzing with anticipation. But instead of brawny men in the buff, you see young, unmarried girls sprinting barefoot down the track. Their tunics are shorter than usual, their hair flowing loose, a radical break from the tight head coverings married women were expected to wear. These girls weren't tossing javelins or grappling in the mud, but they raced with a seriousness that would make any modern coach proud. Winners received olive wreaths and sometimes statues, immortalizing their speed in the very same city where men's victories were carved in stone. Now, let's pivot to Sparta, where rules were made to be broken, or at least dramatically reinterpreted. Imagine you're a Spartan girl. Instead of being cloistered away, you're out in the sunshine, wrestling, running races, even throwing the discus, all in full view of the city's menfolk. Here, strength wasn't just admired, it was essential. The logic? A strong woman would become the mother of strong warriors. It's a classic case of ancient, tough love. The rest of Greece was scandalized by this athletic freedom. But for Spartans, it was a matter of civic pride. If you think CrossFit moms are intense, you haven't seen a Spartan mother-in-law critique your sprinting form. Meanwhile, over in Egypt, the sporting scene took on a different flavor. Slip into a painted tomb, and you'll find women immortalized mid-leap, dancing, spinning, and performing what can only be described as ancient gymnastics. These displays weren't about competition, but about ritual, celebration, and honoring the gods. Imagine a festival where women somersault through the air, their movements precise, their artistry undeniable. Sometimes, pairs of female acrobats are frozen in gravity, defying poses, suggesting a lineage of athletic performance that was both revered and expected. The ancient Egyptians might not have handed out medals, but they certainly knew how to put on a show. Now, let's take a detour to Rome, where everything, including sports, was about spectacle. Elite Roman women were rarely seen breaking a sweat in public. That privilege was reserved for the lower classes and slaves, some of whom became gladiatresses. Yes, female gladiators. Picture the roar of the Colosseum, the sand sticky with anticipation, and a woman stepping into the arena, sword in hand. These female fighters were rare, their existence confirmed by inscriptions and a few surviving accounts. More commonly, Roman women engaged in less bloody pursuits, ball games in the garden, swimming in private pools, or practicing equestrian skills in the privacy of their villas. It wasn't the Olympics, but it was certainly athletic, and in its own way quietly subversive. Hop over to Imperial China during the Tang dynasty, and suddenly the rules change again. Here, noble women weren't just allowed to play polo. They did so right alongside men. Imagine a lush palace courtyard, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, and a blur of colorful robes as women gallop after a ball, mallets swinging with calculated grace. This was one of the only sports in the ancient world where women and men competed together as equals. Later, Confucian scholars would clutch their pearls at the memory, but for a dazzling moment, Tang dynasty women wielded both athletic skill and social power. So, what's left after the crowds disperse, the stadiums crumble, and the olive wreaths turn to dust? The spirit of ancient sports lingers on, pulsing through every soccer match, every Olympic chant, every touchdown dance you see today. Our modern obsession with athletic spectacle is a direct descendant of those ancient competitions. The Olympic Games, revived in 1896, were a conscious homage to their Greek ancestors, complete with solemn oaths, laurel crowns, and the ceremonial flame. A nod to Hestia's sacred fire, now flickering on a global stage. The values may have shifted from pleasing the gods to international cooperation, but the core remains, celebrating the breathtaking possibilities of the human body. If you think today's stadium theatrics are over the top, blame the Romans. Their colossal arenas, their obsession with uniforms, cheering sections, and overblown commentary, all of it echoes the grandeur of gladiatorial games. Even the way fans align themselves with teams, using colors and chants as tribal markers, is a page ripped straight from the imperial playbook. And let's not kid ourselves when we talk about athletes as warriors or trophies as sacred relics. We're channeling something very old and very potent. Ancient Mesoamerican cultures, meanwhile, tied their ball games to ritual and the cosmic order. Thankfully, our championship games don't end with human sacrifice anymore, but the language of battle and myth still clings to sports. Whether you're watching a Super Bowl or a World Cup final, victory is always mythologized. The stakes always just a little bit higher than reality. In China, the elegant bows and arrows of ancient archery contests weren't just about hitting the mark. They were a lesson in discipline, respect, and moral education, the same values that run through martial arts today. Even obscure games like Kuju and Kreda, long forgotten by most, are making a comeback as historians and enthusiasts dig up the roots of modern athleticism. Board games, too, are having a renaissance, proving that competition can be as much about cleverness and luck as it is about brawn. But here's the real kicker. For the ancients, sports were never just games. They were political tools, platforms for expressing identity, and vehicles for religious devotion. When a modern athlete takes a knee, speaks out, or becomes the face of a nation, they're channeling an ancient tradition, using sport as a narrative, a source of power, and a way to carve out a legacy that lasts far beyond the final whistle. In the end, the ancient world didn't just invent sports. It invented the idea that striving for greatness, whether through speed, strength, or sheer determination, could elevate humanity. Sports became stories, rituals, and, in a way, a promise that we can always reach for something just out of reach: honor, meaning, immortality. Now, let's trade the sunshine of the stadium for the cool shadows beneath Paris. A city famous for its radiant boulevards, romantic bridges, and croissants. So flaky, they're practically a health hazard. But as your ever-dutiful time-travel tour guide, I'm here to show you the side of Paris that most tourists never see. Forget the glittering Eiffel Tower and the endless parade of selfie sticks. We're heading underground, to a place where romance comes with a side of existential dread. Picture yourself descending a spiral staircase, each step taking you further from the noise of the living world. The air thickens, the light fades, and suddenly you're in a space where the walls themselves are made entirely of human bones. Welcome to the catacombs, a 200-mile labyrinth that holds the remains of more than 6 million Parisians. Just imagine the city's forgotten masses, neatly arranged from floor to ceiling, skulls grinning in silent greeting as you pass. It all started innocently enough. The catacombs began life as limestone quarries, dug out as early as the Roman era, when Paris needed raw materials to build its cathedrals, bridges, and mansions. For centuries, these tunnels were the city's skeleton, supplying the stones that would become the bones of Paris itself. But by the 1700s, these empty corridors found a new, much grimmer purpose. The living were simply running out of room for the dead. By the middle of the 18th century, Paris's cemeteries were in crisis. Picture the infamous Cemetery of the Innocents, right in the heart of the city, in operation for nearly 1,000 years. Layer upon layer of bodies stacked in communal graves, sometimes 6 or 7 deep. As the city's population swelled, so did the mountain of corpses. Eventually, The ground could take no more. The cemeteries became bubbling pits of decay, the air so thick with stench that even the hardiest Parisian wine couldn't mask it. Neighbors complained of spoiled meat, foul water, and a smell so persistent it seeped through stone walls. Some unlucky souls even found their basement walls cracking open, leaking the grim secrets of the graveyard next door. It was more than just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Disease was inevitable, and the city's famous joie de vivre was rapidly giving way to a much less glamorous joie de mort. In 1763, King Louis XV tried to solve the problem with a royal decree banning burials inside the city. Of course, the church refused to budge. Cemeteries were sacred, and the idea of moving the dead was, to put it mildly, blasphemous. But by the 1780s, the situation had grown so dire that public health officials were forced to intervene. When a cellar wall collapsed and spilled decomposing corpses into a nearby home, the message was clear: the dead had overstayed their welcome. Enter the abandoned limestone quarries, cool, dark, and conveniently out of sight. In 1786, city officials hatched a plan to transfer bones from the overcrowded cemeteries to this subterranean network. The process was macabre in every sense. Picture workers in long robes, moving at night to avoid public outrage, pushing carts draped in black cloth, and accompanied by priests chanting the rites of the dead. The bones were first dumped in heaps, then later arranged with a kind of ghastly artistry. Skulls stacked in neat rows, femurs woven into decorative patterns, even hearts and crosses formed from tibias and vertebrae. It was equal parts sanitation project and performance art. The transfers continued for decades. Cemetery after cemetery was emptied. Saint-Eustache, Madeleine, Montmartre, all their inhabitants joining the growing city beneath the city. The result, an underground necropolis where time stands still, and the bones of plague victims, revolutionaries, and medieval monks lie side by side in eerie silence. Here, Paris preserves not just its dead, but the memory of a city forever teetering between beauty and decay, a metropolis that manages its living and its departed with equal precision. So, next time you stroll the Champs-Élysées or sip coffee at a Parisian cafe, remember that below your feet the city slumbers, silent, watchful, and lined with the bones of centuries past. And as we continue our time-traveling tour, get ready to venture deeper. Because as you step into the ossuary section of the catacombs of Paris, it becomes instantly clear this is no random bone dump. All right, follow me. Down this spiral staircase, shoes echoing off ancient stone, your phone's flashlight barely cutting the darkness. Welcome to the ossuary heart of the Paris catacombs. Here you'll see that this isn't some haphazard bone pile. No, what you're stepping into is a masterpiece of morbid architecture, a cold, deliberate symmetry, constructed not from granite or marble, but from the remains of people who once strolled the city of lights above. Skulls are stacked in soldier straight lines, framed by neat rows of femurs and tibias. In certain corridors, the bones twist into patterns, hearts, crosses, arches, like a macabre art installation dreamed up by someone who clearly had a surplus of bones and a shortage of granite. This wasn't just a matter of convenience or necessity. It was the brainchild of Louis Etienne Ricard de Tully, the inspector of quarries in the early 1800s, a man who looked at a mountain of bones and thought, what this city needs is a little more existential dread with its urban planning. Before Heracart arrived, the bones had simply been dumped in heaps, as if Paris was trying to sweep its mortality under the world's biggest rug. But Heracart had a different vision. He saw the catacombs as a kind of subterranean cathedral, a moral and aesthetic monument, a practical answer to overcrowded cemeteries that doubled as a reminder that, yes, one day, Parisians would all be part of the city's infrastructure in a very literal sense. Under his direction, the ossuary was scrubbed and organized with almost obsessive precision. Bones were arranged into haunting galleries, each wall a silent sermon about the fleetingness of life. Plaques, small, weathered stone markers, tell you which cemetery the bones came from and the year they were relocated. Sometimes you'll see poetic inscriptions. One, carved in stone and completely unambiguous, reads, "Stop. This is the Empire of Death." Not exactly a welcome mat, but it gets the point across. And let's not forget the engineering. These bones aren't just for show, they're structural. In places, they're packed behind retaining walls, hidden from sight, but absolutely essential for holding up the narrow, winding corridors. Imagine being the engineer responsible for a network of tunnels running beneath Paris, and knowing a collapse could mean more than just a few broken bones. It could take out entire neighborhoods. No pressure. Lighting, back then, was sparse and moody. Flickering oil lamps and torches cast wild shadows over eye sockets and rib cages, as if the dead were performing in their own shadow play. Today, electric bulbs reveal the same scenes in harsh clarity, but the surreal effect remains. This is not just an ossuary. It is a carefully designed underworld, a blend of utility, respect, and theatrical display. Every step reminds you that architecture can be both mesmerizing and utterly terrifying. Now, pause for a moment in one of these endless corridors. The faces all blur together because there are none. Just skull after skull. 6 million bodies reduced to anonymous geometry. No names, no epitaphs. Just row upon row of silent, identical witnesses. And yet, beneath this eerie sameness, a question gnaws. Who are these people? The answer is simple and unsettling. They are everyone. The catacombs hold the remains of ordinary Parisians who lived and died over centuries. Bakers, midwives, priests, soldiers, nannies, candle makers, street vendors, people who once jostled through the city's muddy lanes, who prayed in its churches, argued in its taverns, and probably complained about the weather, just like you and me. When their graves overflowed and the cemeteries began to rot, literally oozing death into the streets, the authorities decided it was time for a mass relocation. Down they went, into the earth, joining the city's most exclusive club, the great anonymous multitude. Some of the bones belonged to plague victims, especially from the Black Death and later cholera outbreaks. Entire generations wiped out so quickly that cemeteries became little more than mass graves. Others were casualties of famine, fire, war, or childbirth. Some had been buried for centuries and arrived as well-weathered skeletons. Others, freshly dead, brought a certain, let's say, aroma to the proceedings. The process of moving them was about as ceremonial as taking out the trash after a particularly rough medieval party. No prayers, no processions, just shovels, carts, and a lot of grim determination. But not everyone here was a commoner. Mixed among the masses are the bones of nobles, clergy, and revolutionaries, especially after the chaos of the French Revolution, when the guillotine turned Parisian squares into rivers of blood. Some claim that famous revolutionaries like Danton, Robespierre, or Camille Desmoulins ended up down here, but there's no official record to confirm who's who in the world's largest underground after-party. Down here, your title doesn't matter. In death, all are equal. Impressive, if you think about how hard people work to avoid that during their lifetimes. There's a particularly haunting section believed to contain the bones of monks and nuns, once buried in convent gardens, but eventually evicted by the city's insatiable appetite for space. And then there are the children. You'll notice the smaller bones interspersed among the stacks. No names, no dates, just silent reminders of lives that ended before they really began. The catacombs are, by design, a place of erasure. Down here, every identity dissolves. Peasant, poet, plague victim, or patriot. 6 million souls, all reduced to the same architectural building blocks. And yet, in their silence, the bones speak volumes. A physical record of the price of city life, the churn of history, and the inevitability of death. Once, these people stood shoulder to shoulder. Now, they lie skull to skull. Of course, if you're shuffling along the official, tourist-friendly mile of catacombs, you're only seeing the sanitized, well-lit corridors, Paris's curated version of mortality. But beneath your feet lies a forbidden world. A shadowy sprawl of uncharted tunnels, locked doors, and centuries-old passageways, all crawling with graffiti, hidden chambers, and every so often, the faint thump of forbidden music drifting through the darkness. Welcome, VIP guest, to the secret domain of the cataphiles. Cataphiles are the urban explorers of Paris, the thrill-seekers, history buffs, and full-time mischief-makers who flout city law to access forbidden catacomb zones. Their entry points are as creative as their reputations. Hidden manholes in forgotten parks, storm drains, anonymous basement trapdoors. Once inside, there are no signs, no safety rails, and certainly no Google Maps. Navigation comes by memory, hand-drawn maps, and pure underground intuition. The only thing you can trust is the echo of your own footsteps, and maybe the advice of someone who's survived a few more raves than you. But this isn't just about adrenaline. For many cataphiles, the catacombs are a second city, a sanctuary of history, rebellion, and creativity. Over decades, they've carved out their own spaces in the underworld, makeshift libraries lined with damp, dog-eared books, art galleries splashed with surreal murals, even tiny cinemas where old projectors flicker across bone-lined walls. Some host secret parties, complete with generators, speakers, and candle-lit dance floors built right above ancient skeletons. Imagine clubbing while surrounded by 6 million silent party crashers. The cataphile community is tight-knit and fiercely protective. Entry is strictly by invitation. No tourists allowed unless you know someone. And even then, you'll be tested. Respect for the dead and the tunnels is non-negotiable. Disturb the bones, tag sacred sites, or get caught, and you're out. Or worse, you're left to find your own way through a maze that chews up and spits out the careless. Authorities have been trying to stamp out this underground subculture since 1955, when unofficial exploration of the catacombs became strictly illegal. The dangers are real. Tunnels prone to collapse, sudden floods, air pockets with less oxygen than a medieval monk's wine cellar, and dead ends so confusing. Even seasoned explorers have been lost for days. There are stories of injuries, arrests, even deaths, like the infamous case of the man who disappeared for days and was only rescued after deliriously barking at search dogs who became his only guides back to daylight. Yet, despite every crackdown, the cataphiles endure. The catacombs are simply too vast, too riddled with secrets, for the city to police every entrance. For every sealed doorway, another is discovered. The cataphiles always return. To them, these tunnels are more than just piles of bones. They're freedom, mystery, a place where time dissolves and Paris breathes in a different rhythm, where the living and the dead share a kind of uneasy truce, not in fear, but in mutual reverence. Venture even deeper, and the silence begins to fill, not with voices, but with symbols and messages etched into the limestone. Cryptic arrows, names, faces, verses, and fading paint turn the walls into a kind of living diary. This is the secret language of the tunnels, a palimpsest of graffiti, signs, and codes left by cataphiles, quarrymen, soldiers, and, for all you know, the occasional ghost with an artistic streak. Some of the oldest markings date back to the quarrymen, centuries before this place became a city of the dead. These early miners carved their names, dates, even little arrows and pickaxes, breadcrumbs for the living to find their way in the dark. Some engraved their initials with pride, like ancient signatures in the earth. Others marked exits, or noted the quality of stone, or left sketches, candle flames, ships, tools, anything to say, I was here, and I made it out alive. Once the catacombs became an ossuary, the language evolved. 18th and 19th century workers installed carved plaques labeling the origins of each stack of bones. Some plaques are grimly poetic. Where is death? Always behind you. Others quote scripture or Latin maxims about the vanity of life and the certainty of death, just in case you weren't already feeling existential. But keep going, past the official trails, and modern hands have added their own flair. Cataphile graffiti exploded in the 20th century, some of it pure street art. Entire walls transformed into glowing skeletons, mythical beasts, surreal portraits. Other markings are purely practical, arrows to secret exits, nicknames etched in stone, cryptic directions that only the initiated can decode. If you see something like G.V. Chalik, 30 Men to Monterage, you're in the realm of underground lore. The catacombs have their own map, but it's passed along orally, like a medieval Reddit thread. But instead of upvotes, you get bragging rights for not getting lost. Every room has its own nickname: the beach, a sand-filled cavern, the cellar, the cathedral, the sandbox. Some walls are famous for the images painted on them, like the mushroom forest or the elephant room. Without insider knowledge, you might as well be wandering a labyrinth designed by 6 million anonymous architects. Getting lost isn't just a possibility, it's practically a rite of passage. Look closer, and you'll see traces of occupation, candle holders chipped into the rock, benches made from scavenged stone, rusted hinges where doors once stood guard. Some explorers leave stencils or ink stamps, marking their visit like travelers collecting passport stamps. Except these stamps are a little harder to show off at customs. Others leave poems, bottle caps, small figurines, quiet offerings to the night. In these tunnels, language becomes legacy. Every scrawl, arrow, and painted whisper is part of an evolving story, a never-ending chronicle that declares, someone was here. Someone mattered, even if nobody remembers their name. So, as the echo of your footsteps fades and you pass yet another wall of anonymous skulls, remember, the catacombs are not just a cemetery. They stand as monuments to the mysterious architecture of memory and anonymity, shaped by the hands of the living, haunted by the silence of the dead, and brought to life by the secret rituals of those brave, or perhaps foolish, enough to call the underworld home. And if you're wondering what happens when history itself is forced to hide underground, just wait, because during times of war, the Paris catacombs were more than a macabre curiosity. Let's step into the shadowy corridors where legends were born, armies hid, and the legacy of the catacombs took on new, enduring life. All right, VIP time travelers, grab your metaphorical hard hats and keep your existential dread handy. We're about to plunge into the heart of Paris's underworld, literally and figuratively, where war, legend, and the grand circus of tourism collide in the endless darkness of the catacombs. If you thought Paris was all about croissants and lovelocks, think again. Down here, it's more survive the revolution than fall in love by the Seine. Picture yourself in revolutionary Paris. The streets above are a carnival of chaos, guillotines slicing through the air by day, political heads rolling like a very grim game of bucksheball. But as the city tries to reinvent itself, the bones of its past, quite literally, are being shuffled below your feet. Step into the catacombs at midnight. The air is thick and cool, echoing with the distant hum of revolution. As you grip your flickering lantern, you realize you're not just standing in a boneyard. You're inside a secret network that's about to play a starring role in the city's survival. By night, while Paris above suffers the fever dream of upheaval, the tunnels below become highways for the living as much as repositories for the dead. Rumor has it, the revolutionaries themselves used these catacomb corridors as covert passageways. Imagine you're darting through the tunnels, cloak flapping, trying to dodge royalist patrols. You're plotting insurrection in the same shadowy halls where bones are stacked as high as your head. Somewhere in the gloom, whispered plans echo off skulls that probably saw their own share of regime changes. These aren't just bones. They're silent witnesses to every plot, every betrayal, every frantic escape. Who needs encrypted text messages when you've got 6 million silent listeners? Fast forward a century and a half. It's 1940, and Paris is under Nazi occupation. The city above might be draped in swastika banners, but below, the real action is happening in the catacombs. The Wehrmacht and SS, never ones to pass up a good underground lair, decide these tunnels make the perfect place for a secret bunker. Deep beneath Place d'Enfer, Rochereau, Reinforced concrete walls go up. Radios crackle. Orders are whispered in German. Entire sections are mapped and fortified, turning the catacombs into a subterranean chessboard. But let's not forget the French resistance, the unsung masters of making life miserable for their occupiers. Picture yourself as a resistance fighter, flashlight in hand and ration can rattling in your pack. With a quick nod to your cataphile guide, the original Parisian urban explorers who know these tunnels better than their own living rooms, you slip past booby traps and Nazi patrols. You hold clandestine meetings where the only witnesses are centuries-old femurs. You stash weapons, plot sabotage, and perhaps scrawl a bit of anti-fascist graffiti in a hidden alcove. It's guerrilla warfare, but the ghosts are on your side. Every so often, you stumble upon relics of these secret wars. A rusted tin of biscuits left during an air raid, the melted remains of a candle, or a wall blackened by a makeshift stove. There are bomb shelters carved into the limestone, where families once huddled in the cold, hoping the world above would still be there when they emerged. It's hard not to feel the collective pulse of hope, fear, and defiance echoing in the darkness. Even after the war, many of these passageways were bricked up, their secrets left to ferment in the silence. But if you listen closely, you can still sense the tension, the desperate creativity, the stubborn refusal of Paris to surrender. Of course, where there are bones and tunnels, legends sprout like mushrooms after rain. The catacombs are a breeding ground for ghost stories and urban folklore, Paris's own underworld of myth, where fact and fiction are as tangled as the tunnels themselves. Let's not kid ourselves. If you've got millions of skulls and centuries of secrets, you're going to end up with more than a few restless spirits. One of the most persistent tales is that of the Phantom of the Catacombs. Some say he was once a quarryman, doomed to wander these passageways for eternity after getting lost in the labyrinth. Others whisper about a plague victim searching for his family, pacing endlessly through galleries of bones, his footsteps echoing just behind yours. Cataphiles, those intrepid souls who treat the catacombs like their own subterranean playground, swear they've felt icy draughts where there should be none, heard whispers in languages long dead, and experienced waves of nausea that vanish as quickly as they come. Somewhere, in the pitch black, you might catch a glimpse of movement just out of the corner of your eye. Or is it just your imagination running wild in the dark? Then there's the infamous camcorder legend. Picture it. The early 1990s, shoulder pads everywhere, and a group of cataphiles stumble across a grimy video camera deep in a forbidden sector of the tunnels. The tape they find is unsettling. It shows a lone explorer, flashlight flickering, wandering deeper and deeper into the maze. His breathing turns ragged, his footsteps frantic. The camera spins, the walls blur, panic builds. Suddenly, the footage ends with a thud as the camera drops to the floor, abandoned in the darkness. The explorer, never identified. The tape became a viral sensation, a found footage horror story for a new era. Is it true? Maybe. But in the catacombs, every shadow hides its own truth. Other stories are pure Parisian surrealism, tales of secret chambers where bones are arranged into thrones, or shadowy cults performing rituals by candlelight. In the early 2000s, explorers stumbled upon a sealed room complete with a functioning telephone line, a fully stocked bar, and a working cinema carved right into the limestone. On the wall, a message in bold letters: "Do not try to find us." Now, that's what I call an exclusive club. Good luck getting on that guest list. Skeptics will roll their eyes and declare it all nonsense. But the power of the catacombs lies precisely in that twilight zone between fact and folklore. It's a space where the imagination fills in the gaps left by flickering torchlight and echoing footsteps. Whether you believe the tales or chalk them up to overactive nerves and too much wine, there's no denying the catacombs have a peculiar talent for making your skin crawl. But let's climb up the spiral staircase of history and blink our way into the present. Today, the Paris catacombs are one of the city's strangest, most irresistible attractions. Hundreds of thousands line up every year, eager for a brush with mortality, or at least a selfie with a neatly arranged pile of femurs. Tourists, poets, goth teens, and Instagram influencers all squeeze through the narrow corridors, clutching their audio guides and marveling at the sheer audacity of a city that stores its dead like so many library books. The official ossuary, opened to the public in 1809, was meant as a solemn reminder, a place to contemplate life's brevity with a side of existential dread. Early visitors shuffled through by lantern glow, sometimes led by priests who probably issued stern warnings about appropriate behavior in the presence of so much death. These days the lighting is better, the walls are reinforced, and the health and safety regulations are a bit more robust. But that hush, that eerie sense of awe, still lingers. No amount of signage or guided tours can quite erase the chill that comes from staring into the eye sockets of a stranger who died 2 centuries ago. Artists, poets, and philosophers have always been drawn to the catacombs, unable to resist the siren call of organized mortality. Victor Hugo roamed these tunnels for inspiration. Salvador Dali called them beautiful, which is probably the most Dali thing ever said. For some, the catacombs are a pilgrimage, a journey to the center of death's labyrinth, where you can marvel at how meticulously the city has stockpiled its former citizens. Of course, not everyone is thrilled by this bone tourism. Critics argue that turning a mass grave into a photo op is disrespectful, a macabre trivialization of millions of lost lives. They're not entirely wrong. As you pose for that perfect Instagram shot, it's easy to forget that these aren't props. They're people. Every skull belonged to someone with hopes, regrets, maybe a favorite pastry. Now they're anonymous, stacked like history's most unsettling Jenga tower. Yet, the catacombs endure for a reason. They force us to confront the scale of existence, the mind-boggling number of lives that came before us. These bones are more than a foundation for myths and sidewalks. They are the bedrock of Paris itself, the literal support beams holding up bakeries and bistros and all-night jazz clubs. The dead, it turns out, are still carrying the city on their shoulders. And here's the twist. When you finally emerge from the gloom and dust, blinking in the Parisian sunlight, the world feels impossibly bright and loud. There's a new sharpness to every sound, every color. Suddenly, life seems precious, ridiculous, and wildly beautiful. The catacombs don't glorify death. They sharpen your appetite for life. They remind us of our fragility, our brevity, and our penchant for stacking skeletons into neat rows. So, as your personal time travel tour guide, let me leave you with this. Everything we build, cities, stories, love affairs, drinking songs, we build on bones. And maybe, just maybe, one day Paris will add ours to the silent archive beneath its streets, where legends never sleep and the past is always waiting for its next visitor.